Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining our webinar this afternoon on our new report, The Power of Sustainable Purchasing. I'm going to give folks another minute to call in, and then we'll get started. All right. So I'm Eliza Kelston. I'm a policy manager here at ASBC. I lead our policy campaigns on the environment as well as our work on sustainable purchasing. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. We have an excellent presentation lined up for you. Just as a logistical question, we're going to be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions come up during the webinar, please submit them via the question or chat function on your computer, and then I will read questions out at the end and either answer them myself or pass them along to Chris if you have a question about the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council or benchmarks. So as many of you know, the American Sustainable Business Council is a national network of triple bottom line businesses, and we represent companies that believe business can be profitable while doing good for people and the planet. We have over 200 direct business members as well as other business association members, which totals over 250,000 businesses in our network. Our policy work focuses on 4 key areas: the environment, the high-road workplace, safer chemicals, and good government. And within those buckets, we work on a wide range of policy campaigns, from carbon pricing to sustainable purchasing to paid family leave and ingredient transparency. So sustainable purchasing came up as an issue for us because we noticed that over the last several decades, companies and organizations came to recognize the risks and opportunities in their supply chains. And there had been a growing focus on both environmentally friendly or green purchasing, as well as supplier diversity, or finding ways to purchase from minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and other companies from historically underutilized communities. But oftentimes these programs are specific, individual, and tend to be separate from each other. So we felt that in order for organizations to really maximize their purchasing power for good, there needed to be a more integrated and broader analysis of what sustainability in purchasing could look like. So we started this project and creating this report to find a broader definition of sustainable purchasing, determine how it could be incentivized, and how certain programs can help remedy some of the world's most pressing challenges, like mitigating climate change and reducing income inequality. In addition to identifying ways purchasers can change their behavior, we also wanted to identify barriers to achieving these goals and some possible solutions, which led to a discussion of benefits of different types of models, such as supply-side aggregation, like co-ops, or new tools and technologies making it easier for large purchasers to identify products and services that are green and from diverse local and high-road suppliers. So some of you might be asking, what is sustainable procurement? Sustainable purchasing, in our definition, we used our triple bottom line business values and understanding of the best ways to build a sustainable economy to identify 5 key criteria for sustainable purchasing. And this is the wheel that you see on the right. It includes buying locally, which strengthens a community's economy. Local independent businesses have higher recirculation rates in the community, meaning that money spent with local businesses is more likely stays in the community longer. We support promoting environmental sustainability. McKinsey study found that more than 80% of greenhouse gas emissions and a majority of social impacts are perpetrated in supply chains. Seeking supplier diversity, so supporting those minority and women-owned companies, like I mentioned previously, as well as other historically underutilized businesses. welcoming worker ownership. Worker-owned companies share profits with their worker owners, which helps reduce income inequality and provide greater opportunities to build wealth for larger numbers of people. And then implementing high-road workplace practices. So the high-road workplace fosters stable success. Companies hold a long-term perspective, and they see the workplace as a vehicle to create significant business and social good. So we believe that if a sustainable purchasing policy focuses on these 5 things and has specific ideas to target these 5 criteria, they will be able to do the most good with how they purchase and help build a sustainable economy through their supply chain. So the first section of our report, we have 3 kind of key findings for the report, and they're broken into our 3 different sections. So the first one, good policy creates demand, focuses on purchasing policies from the federal government to municipal governments to private sector purchasing. The second one focuses on some of those aggregation supply models that I mentioned previously. And the final one looks at innovation, different tools, technologies, and models that people are using to overcome barriers to sustainable purchasing. And our webinar today is going to really focus on the last one. But before we dive into that, I wanted to give a few brief examples that are from our report. So the first one, good policy creates demand. Organizations have to purchase goods and services in order to operate. But by being intentional with what they buy and how they buy it, they can have a great positive impact on social and environmental issues. So organizations need to have smart, fully fledged out policies to create the right demand. So this example focuses on one of our members, two of our members actually, Ben & Jerry's and Grayson Bakery. So Ben & Jerry's is a benefit corp business. They're a high road sustainable business, as is Grayson Bakery. And when the owner of Grayson Bakery and the owner of Ben & Jerry's met, they decided that based on their values, they wanted to find a way to partner. So that was back in the 80s. And since then, Ben & Jerry's and Grayson Bakery have worked together to produce Ben & Jerry's wildly popular chocolate fudge brownie ice cream. Through this contract alone, Ben & Jerry's supports hundreds of local jobs and a supplier with a track record of community development. Grayson Bakery runs the Center for Open Hiring, which not only do they create jobs at in their business for people who have barriers to employment, maybe they have limited education or criminal records or suffered from homelessness or lack of access to housing. Grayson Bakery also runs an organization to study open hiring and how other organizations can implement open hiring practices. So this is just one example of how a high road company wanting to purchase from a high road supplier in their supply chain helps create jobs, good high road jobs throughout their supply chain. So the second example is for our aggregating supply section. So as many of you know, ASBC works on worker ownership issues. And so we wanted to think about how supply aggregation models or worker-owned companies can have more access to the supply chains of large companies. And one of the reasons why we think this is such a great model is because it's easier for large organizations to contract with local businesses if they don't have to break down bids or have multiple small contracts. If they work with a supply aggregation model, for example, a food co-op, they can be providing revenue to lots of small independent farmers or retailers, but they only have to deal with one centralized purchasing unit. So this example, the Tuscarora Organic Growers is a producer-owned co-op in Baltimore and DC. It was founded in 1988 with 3 farmer members, and they now have over 40. And 3/4 of their revenue is returned to farmer members, and 1/4 is used to cover expenses, as you can see in the graph on the presentation. And in 2013, TOG grossed $3.1 million in sales of member-grown produce and another $1 million in non-member-grown produce, which is significantly higher than any one of these farmer growers could do on their own. And then the final example that I'm going to talk about is for our innovation section. So Chris from the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council is going to give you a more in-depth example, but I wanted to give you one other from our report. So one of the barriers that we identified to sustainable purchasing is how it's really challenging for large purchasers to be able to identify new or small or local suppliers all the time in their community. And it's hard for these small local suppliers to figure out how to get in the door with large purchasers. So one organization that's trying to make it easier for all of these groups is the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City. They work with foundations and anchor institutions to help them better understand their local impacts and how procurement can be a tool to building a sustainable economy. In 2014, they released a report that analyzed purchasing data from 6 anchor institutions in Newark, New Jersey. They found that over half of the total procurement spending of these 6 institutions could be easily shifted to a local business in the Newark community, but they were currently only spending 1% of their total purchasing power with local businesses. So then on the supplier side, they looked at the capacity of New York businesses to meet the demand of these organizations, and they found 18 industries where large purchasers could easily shift their spending, which represented over $321 million in potential new revenue. And there were over 400 local businesses within those 18 industries that were qualified. So the individual purchasing officers at those large organizations weren't able to figure that out on their own, but because an organization like ICIC was able to find funding to do this big study of the local Newark economy, they were able to figure out opportunities for these purchasers to shift their spend and start buying more products from the local community. So another really innovative model that we wanted to focus on today and really introduce everyone to is from the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. So founded in 2013, the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, or SPLC, convenes buyers, suppliers, and public interest advocates to develop programs that simplify and standardize sustainable purchasing efforts by large organizations. And for SPLC, the definition of sustainability includes social, economic, and environmental stewardship. So Chris Verano is a sustainability professional who works at SPLC to manage the benchmark program. So she is going to start her presentation now on the SPLC benchmark program. And remember, if you have any questions come up, please put them into the question or chat function of the presentation so that I can ask them to Chris when she's finished with her presentation.
Great. Eliza and everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to talk a little bit more about our innovation example, SPLC benchmark, and thanks for that great introduction, Eliza. Can you please forward the slide? So we are, I'm going to share a bit about the SPLC benchmark approach that we've developed as a group of member organizations. And I'm going to share more about the pilot launch of that program, which started last fall, last August, and ran through just the early part of this year with 14 independent purchasing organizations within the government sector. I'll just give you a quick overview of really what is the benchmark approach, and we'll talk about some of the benefits that those organizations enjoyed as participants in the pilot. And then last but not least, I'm going to pluck out a couple of key takeaways that came out of this pilot implementation of benchmark specific to the sector that we focused on. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so SPLC has a number of program offerings to its multi-sector community, but just like ASBC, we focus specifically on really trying to drive a sustainable global economy through institutional purchasing. And so when we talk about where the benchmark program fits into our offerings, we often use this SPLC service offering pyramid that helps to describe what we want to provide our members in terms of understanding what sustainable purchasing is, and that's that bottom piece, really bringing the community together, forming a common language around sustainable purchasing, providing through membership guided development, things like category guidance and training. What Benchmark does is it really seeks to address this upper portion of the services pyramid around competitive advantage. So as you had mentioned earlier, Eliza, we've got different pockets of really great activities going on in different organizations, but how do you put that together holistically? How do you create a sustainable purchasing program and then measure what you're doing against a leadership level, really compare it to what we're calling the SPLC maturity model, which we've developed. And then once you've got that measure, how do you compare to your peers? How are they doing against that leadership maturity model? Ultimately, allowing us to be able to recognize and inspire organizations to go further. Next slide. You can build this slide out, Eliza. If you click about 3 or 4 times, keep going. There you go. Perfect. All right. So benchmark is an approach that really is taking a look at the processes in which you've embedded sustainable purchasing into your operations, into your either indirect or direct purchasing, depending on your lens. And it seeks to answer these questions that we have here. What really does a good sustainable purchasing program look like? How does your organization's program measure up to that leadership level? And how do I compare to my peers, whether they're in my sector or maybe in another sector? And what can I learn from all this to really move forward? Ultimately, benchmark is seeking to answer those questions, provide specific insights into what will take your program to the next level so that you can really make that strategic plan for moving forward. Next slide. And I mentioned very briefly earlier that benchmark is built off of what SPLC and its members and the benchmark working group have put together as the leadership maturity model. And this is a total of 38 prioritized best practices and key methodologies that our collective teams have prioritized again and said that this is really what drives leadership and sustainable purchasing. These items need to be employed at different maturity levels along the way to really achieve that sustainable global economy that we have a vision to. Next slide. And it's very important to note, again, that the maturity model that sits behind benchmark, these best practices, these evaluation questions, and the criteria involved in determining where you are on that maturity path are really set as a high bar, and they're purposely set that way. We again are driving not to the levels that are being demonstrated today in the world, but really to the levels that are required to achieve that sustainable global economy through purchasing. Next slide. So the benchmark process, what we would call the full assessment process of the 38 best practice evaluation questions, is built on an online platform. And as we offer this to others and as the pilot program had also executed, we start with collecting and discovering information around that program via an online data submission tool that you see here on the left. That information is then validated via third party, and the approach allows us to summarize 2 independent reports for the participating organizations. The first report is that top one on the right that basically tells you where your organization's maturity is against that leadership maturity model and provides very specific instructions, next steps in achieving the next level of leadership in those 38 criteria. The second report is the report that then takes your results and compares it to others. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to move into some of the experiences that our participants in benchmark have had to date. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we went through a pilot program, actually 2 pilot programs technically, since last fall with the benchmark platform. And we were fortunate enough to have a sponsor, the National Association of State Procurement Officers, co-fund the finish of the development of the platform as well as the cohorts themselves. The cohorts were essentially workshop-based approaches to administer the benchmark maturity model through the benchmark platform. So we had two groups. The left group is the state level cohort, which was a group, as you can see, of 6 states that participated in benchmark via live interactive workshops together. And then the second was a similar approach with a cohort being an in-depth internal investigation and assessment of 8 independent purchasing departments within the state of California. So the state of California really are pioneers here, really, not only participating in the pilot at the state level, but also taking a more internal approach and applying that learnings both externally as well as internally within their organizations. Next slide. So this slide is really just a high-level summary of some of the benefits that our cohort participants on the previous slide have really shared with us along the way. What we've found with this program is that the benefits can vary depending on the maturity of the organization, depending on the size and complexity of the organization. There are definitely some examples of benefits that cross all of those different types of organizations, but this is kind of a high-level overview of some of the things that they've been able to take away and really share their stories with us in regards to that. One of my favorite stories really focuses on that top left box, the improving operational efficiencies. At an organizational level, especially with large organizations, it can very often be difficult to be able to identify all those independent actions that are contributing to what you would call a sustainable purchasing program. And so with one of our participants, as part of this discovery process through the benchmark approach, they were actually able to identify a whole separate department that had been collecting and publicly reporting on supplier diversity information that, quite frankly, helped to establish ongoing reporting, improved metrics reporting for the entire organization. So here we have an example where, again, that discovery process that's involved in going through the benchmark approach really helped to align and partner and further accelerate a supplier diversity example in a way that they couldn't have done with their own resources and their own capacity. So really capitalizing on that improvement of operational efficiencies. Again, many other benefits in the process of going through this example. This same department was also enlightened of the fact that they were really supporting a much bigger vision around sustainable purchasing, and ultimately, enjoyed becoming part of that team of champions that will continue to support that great work. Next slide. Okay, so we talked a little bit about who has been able to work within the benchmark platform. They've done it through the cohorts. Now let's focus a little bit higher in terms of what were we able to identify at a sector level. So if we take these 14 organizations and we start to study what we're seeing specifically within the government sector, the state government sector, what additional insights can we achieve from the benchmark approach? Next slide. So one of the biggest key takeaways that we wanted to highlight was not specific to the government sector as much as it was just an accomplishment, and that is really being able to prove out that the SPLC benchmark approach even works. So when you think of all the activities that we're doing in sustainable purchasing, just the task of being able to measure and compare your obtained maturities to other organizations is quite exciting. And being able to take these 14 organizations through the assessment, through the learnings around what was being investigated, discovered, measured, really helped us apply real-world data and real-world scenarios to this idea that we could measure and benchmark sustainable purchasing maturity. So all in all, you know, at the high level for the 14 organizations, we were actually able to say the sector is around the developing phase. So you see on the top, it says initiating, developing, improving, and leading. You know, we've been able to actually obtain that visibility to where we are as a community within the sector. Next slide. This slide kind of goes, double clicks down, if you will, into that next level. So, oops, there we go. So it's not a flag, an American flag, although it looks like it. This takeaway is really about enjoying and being inspired by the fact that these organizations not only know where they are in terms of maturity, but they, for the first time, understand what they need to do to get to that next level. So again, if you think about, you know, what you're doing within your organization and where you think you need to go in order to develop your program, Benchmark is actually able to assess and give you those strategic next steps. So while these two groups may have paused when they initially identified where they were falling in terms of the maturity curve, what they're also realizing is they have clarity that nobody else in the world has today in order to move forward. Next slide. The next slide here really talks about Benchmark being able to identify specific needs of specific populations, even within a sector. So very early on with both of the cohorts, what we recognize is that we had almost two groups of participants. The first group were what we call the emerging leaders. These are the groups that were charted on the top right chart. And they were organizations, they are organizations that are doing very well in very specific areas of commitment, areas of you know, being able to actually define a sustainable purchasing policy and actually achieving validation for leading in those areas. Now keep in mind, leading is a very special measurement or maturity. So these are our emerging leaders that really don't need help getting started. They need help really identifying how to expand their programs and really leverage one another to do that in the most efficient way. And then we had the program initiators, and these folks are charted below them. And you can see that, and you can even imagine, maybe some of you are those organizations where, again, you have those pockets of work, but you don't have a formal sustainable purchasing program in place. You need some help really understanding what the business case is that you could take to your executives to really justify additional action and more formalness around that program. So from our perspective, from FPLC's perspective, this really helped to identify what we need to be able to accommodate with regards to our members, particularly in this sector, but it also helps to just shed some additional light in these organizations in terms of what their needs are going to be moving forward. Next slide. And this should be the final key takeaway, just understanding which of the operational levers are strong versus really need to maybe get a little bit more investment in. So one of the ways that Benchmark organizes its question set is really around what most of you are probably familiar with, these operational levers that are on the horizontal chart or horizontal line here in the chart. So operational levers like supplier engagement, organizational process and policy, stakeholder engagement, staff engagement. If you can envision best practices below each of those categories, that is really what we're talking about within that 38 question set maturity model. And by organizing it this way and taking a look at the obtained data, we're actually able to identify really an untapped or underutilized opportunity to engage suppliers in things like setting sustainable purchasing goals, in things like evaluating enterprise level sustainability within the supply base. So very interestingly, and almost in surprise, I think, for all of us, including the participants, we saw opportunities where we could expand on this in this sector in order to further their programs. Next slide. So we have recognized through the cohort program approach that many different organizations are at different places, need different things to be able to really engage in this new innovation that we've created, the benchmark platform. So we're continuing to investigate different ways that members and non-members can take advantage of it. Next slide, Eliza. Next slide. Oops. Okay. Oh, go ahead, Eliza. You've got my contact information. I was just going to say, if anybody's interested in learning a little bit more about it, or if you have questions after the call, I'm happy to talk to you about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. If you have questions, please, again, submit them through the question function on the webinar. I had one come in already. Chris, could you share some examples of effective supplier engagement actions?
Sure. So let me just talk a little bit more about that. So I'm assuming that's in reference to one of the last slides that I shared, where how do you expand on supplier engagement? So we do measure on several criteria around that, but the two examples that I gave while I was presenting that slide, the first example meaning bringing in your suppliers to help you establish what your sustainable purchasing goals are going to be. That was one example that kind of came to the surface in the course of taking this group through the process. The second was, and I know coming from the private industry actually does this pretty regularly, which is evaluating the enterprise level sustainability of your suppliers. In other words, doing investigations for things like, do they have a corporate social responsibility report? Are they engaging external stakeholders to establish goals? So you have, some specific work around their products, but some specific evaluations that you're doing to look at them as a whole, not just at what their products are really achieving in their use. Hopefully that helps.
Yes. So another question came in that one of the challenges for purchasers in determining results is the lack of calculators that help calculate the cost savings and environmental benefits of procuring sustainable products and services. And they want to know if SPLC is doing any work to help spur the development of those types of calculators.
Good question. And this is a calculator specific to cost savings, looking at total cost of ownership and
yeah, the question
Eliza?
Yeah, the question is in response to cost savings specifically around environmental benefits. So I would guess, yeah, the total cost of ownership. Maybe if you're buying a more expensive product up front, how can you, if there's a calculator that you could take that to a supervisor and say this might be more expensive now, but here's why it's going to save us later. Yeah,
the idea of a calculator is a great one because it just would make all of our lives much easier. However, what I find even with our benchmark participants is that, things like the total cost of ownership are largely emerging ideas and very specific to a particular example of what you're purchasing. So they tend to be very, very customized in that sense. Again, drawing from my past experience in private industry, we did a lot of cost savings calculations around waste reduction, but there wasn't necessarily a generic calculator that you could pull out of that because it was very specific to, you know, the process that we were using at Cisco to roll up cost savings and report that appropriately. What I will say, you know, with regards to that in SPLC is that we're very in tune to, you know, being able to share business cases, to be able to share you know, at least an example of total cost of ownership. And we do that primarily right now, not through calculators, but through case studies and webinars and, you know, sharing and as Benchmark grows out, sharing of those examples in our programs like Benchmark as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add that one of the parts of the innovation section of our report was to try to identify some of the new tools that people are using to help better understand. If we want to talk specifically about green products, I think that's kind of the most, or the area where I've seen kind of the most robust development of these tools. But I know I've seen a couple where the company or organization will work with you to figure out what you're purchasing, where there are kind of opportunities to be more green. So maybe their software will work with your internal software and they can help you identify greener products and then can help identify places for you to save money. So it's not exactly the same as a calculator where you could just type in what you're purchasing. But I know that there are some organizations that are working to make that process easier by developing new software for that. Let's see. So we had another question about transparency. So why transparency is difficult in purchasing, and what, especially specifically government purchase. I think that must have come out specifically for the state government example, and why, or if there are ways that government could be more transparent in talking about how they purchase and what they purchase and why.
So the question is around whether or not we found challenges with regards to transparency in government, Eliza?
Yes, and if there were any reasons as to why.
Sorry about that. I just had to close the window. We have some lawn mowing going on right now. So, you know, as a whole, the government sector is by default very transparent. So, you know, in terms of my experience with them on, you know, on Benchmark, they actually enjoyed being able to share websites where they're already talking about executive orders that require product sustainability disclosure. You know, they regularly publicly post the results of their activities. So when I compare, you know, where they are to what my private experience was in supply chain, I would say that there's already a culture of transparency from that perspective. You know, that said, I think when it comes to requiring suppliers to be transparent, that's kind of where the supplier engagement opportunity started to poke up its head. So, you know, asking for suppliers to publicly disclose their own sustainability goals, and encouraging suppliers to be as transparent as the state organizations themselves. That's a new field for them, versus, you know, again, this existing culture of transparency that they have in their own operations.
Great. And I know the federal government also has data on what the federal government buys, and they provide a lot of information on that as well. And all of that, I believe, can be found online. Another specific question for you, Chris, is someone asked if you could explain what category guidance means.
Sure. So category guidance is on the indirect purchasing side, and I guess you could apply it to the direct as well if you're talking about commodity guidance. So category guidance is referring to sustainable purchasing guidance around a specific category of products. So in indirect procurement, you may have a director assigned to all of the, let's say, lab supply purchasing or IT purchasing. That's a common one regardless of the sector. So category just refers to what is being purchased, a category of products.
Oh, sorry, I was still on mute there. I've had a couple of questions come in more generally about SPLC. Chris, could you talk a little bit more about SPLC's other work, maybe mention a little bit more about the guidance and some of the other areas that SPLC does work on, and maybe how some people could get involved?
Sure, great, thanks. So SPLC is actually a relatively new organization. We've been around since 2012, and we, again, were founded to really drive sustainable purchasing leadership across sectors, and we are, as our name says, dedicated to just sustainable purchasing. There are a lot of organizations that that holistically drive sustainable practices, but we recognize that there was a need to really have that cross-sector view specific to sustainable purchasing. We started initially with program offerings really focused around our annual summit, which is a great way to just get peer-to-peer active engagement in a conference-like setting where many of our members will bring the stories and the successes that they've had over the past year. So that conference is once a year, usually in the April-May timeframe. But then, part of being a member is really to get access to all of the resources behind the scenes, and that is, very active discussion forum where members will post things that they're working on that they need help with, where other people can, come in and lend a hand, give some advice. We have, as I mentioned, we have a lot of case studies that have been collected as a result of the leadership awards that we do annually at the summit. Those case studies are all available to people to choose from based on what you're working on. And we also, like you do, Eliza, we host webinars to give people a chance to talk about their work. The guidance document version 2.0 is kind of, I mentioned it at the pyramid slide, but that's kind of the foundational resource that explains how to set up a sustainable purchasing program, what's included in that, and then really starts to give that more explicit help on, how would you set up a sustainable purchasing program for your IT products? How would you set up a sustainable purchasing program for your cleaning supplies? And we do touch on the direct side at great length as well. We find that both the direct and indirect purchasing sides share a lot of the same best practices, but we do also have more specialized guidance, if you will, on the indirect side with regards to the category guidance.
Great. I saw.
Yeah.
I was just going to say,
ahead,
I saw the other day that you all, I think, released some policy templates or policy development guidance. That might be useful as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the reminder, Eliza. So the really cool thing, thanks to our executive director, Sam Hummel, is that we do provide a lot of resources to non-members as well. So Eliza, I'm happy to give you some of the links to access what you just mentioned, and then even on the benchmark side, we have a quick assessment, which is a free downloadable worksheet that allows you to go through a very high-level cursory, introductory, if you will, benchmark evaluation. So yeah, I'm happy to pass along some of the links to those types of available resources.
That would be great, thank you. I had one other question come in about the system that you use and if it incorporates human rights factors into the assessment, as well as the opportunity for workers to create a union or organize for better working conditions.
Mm-hmm. It does, and what I didn't get into too much detail with earlier is that the first part of the benchmark approach is really defining what your sustainable purchasing program is. So if you're specifically working on labor rights, for example, then then that is selected, and that is what you're measuring when you go through that process evaluation. So it is very flexible in terms of what it evaluates. Again, remember it's evaluating how well you've embedded sustainable purchasing into your purchasing processes. It really, based off of that, it's very easily applicable to whatever you define to be your sustainable purchasing program.
Great. Thank you so much. So we have a few minutes left, so if folks have other questions, please submit them through that question or chat function. But I'll just point us back to the presentation here briefly. As I mentioned, ASBC just released our Power of Sustainable Purchasing full report, and you can download it on our website at asbcouncil.org/procurement report. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to send me an email. My email is up on the screen. I'm Eliza again, for those of you who joined a little bit after we started. If you want to learn more about SPLC generally, or specifically the benchmark program, I have the URL up here as well. So sustainablepurchasing.org /benchmarking. And if you have specific questions for Chris, she generously shared her email with us. So chris@sustainablepurchasing.org. I've had a couple of questions come in about the report. Yes, it is available for download for anyone, whether you're an ASBC member or not, but we hope that you are. So if you're not, please get in touch with me, and I can connect you with our membership director, Valerie Forby. This presentation also has been recorded and will be up on our website either later today or tomorrow. So if you would like to reference it, you can watch the whole presentation again, or just download the slides. So that will be available again later this afternoon or first thing tomorrow. I did have one other question come in before we finish up here. They asked, are any of the goals, even leadership goals, supportive of limiting purchases of meat or dairy, specifically things having to do with sustainable agriculture? So I guess a question about how food purchasing and the environment kind of interact with the guidance and the benchmark program.
Food purchasing in particular, I may need to follow up on that one more specifically with our team, Eliza.
Okay.
I know that we are in the process of developing category guidance in food purchasing, and I don't recall at the moment if that is already available publicly. I believe that it is, but in answer to the question, it is considered and would be part of what we would define as sustainable purchasing. So, just to clarify, we have 3 pillars in our definition of sustainable purchasing. So environmental, social, and economic factors. And food purchasing would definitely fall under that categorization. And we do, like I said, have some category guidance that I believe has been released, but I am not 100% sure. I'd have to follow up.
Great. Thanks so much. That's the last question that we had come in. So once again, if you would like to share this presentation or watch it again, you'll be able to do so on our website later today, asbcouncil.org/webinars. If you want to download the report, you can visit our website, asbcouncil.org/procurement report. And if you have any questions for me or for Chris, please don't hesitate to email. My email is ekelston@asbcouncil.org. And Chris is at chris@sustainablepurchasing.org. So thank you, Chris, for all of your time this afternoon and for all of you for joining. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Thanks so much, Eliza, for the opportunity, and congratulations on the report.
Thank you so much.